Imagine this. You go into battle with only 150 men. Standing across from you, 800 trained soldiers. You fight until there's nothing left to fight with. So you raise your own sword, the signal that you surrender. And in return, that same sword, the one you handed over, is used to kill you. This is not where it ends. The men who were still alive, who had already laid down their arms, hands raised, they were shown no mercy either. And the man who gave that order, he grew up on this very soil. He once called these people his neighbors. This is the darkest chapter of the American Revolution. September 6, 1781, Lieutenant Colonel William Ledyard stood on an earthen wall above the Thames River and watched 800 British soldiers come ashore on his home ground. He had 150 men behind him. Most had never fired a shot in anger. The man leading the force against him had grown up 13 miles from this exact spot, had traded in these exact streets, had once called these people his neighbors. His name was Benedict Arnold, and by sunset, he would order his own countrymen slaughtered after they had already surrendered. This is how. By the summer of 1781, the American Revolution had ground into its sixth brutal year. The South was bleeding. The Continental Treasury was empty. Congress had no money to properly reinforce a small coastal fort in Connecticut, let alone pay the men who might defend it. And New London had become one of the last busy privateer ports, still tormenting British shipping up and down the coast. Fast American ships slipping out to sea, seizing British cargo, and sailing it home for profit. To London, that harbor was a wound that needed closing. To the soldiers sent to close it, this looked like routine work. Burn a few warehouses, scatter some militia, sail home by nightfall. Arnold knew this harbor better than any British officer alive. He had walked these docks as a boy. He had run cargo through this river as a young merchant, long before treason ever crossed his mind. Now, he commanded the force sent to burn it to the ground, and to punish personally the state that had once called him a hero. Waiting for him across the river stood a man who had never wanted this command in the first place. William Ledyard was 40 years old, a Groton-born militia officer, respected more for steadiness than glory. He had spent years begging Connecticut's government for cannon, for powder, for trained men to properly hold Fort Griswold. He got almost none of it. What he commanded instead was a half-finished earthwork fort, undermanned by design, defended by farmers, fishermen, and boys who had grabbed a musket that morning because the alarm guns were firing. Arnold's insight was simple and cold. He understood that New London's defenses were weak because he had helped design the very trade routes that made this town rich. He knew exactly where the militia would gather. He knew exactly how long word would take to spread up the coast. He knew exactly where to strike. There was something else driving him too. He had spent a year since his defection at West Point, being called a traitor in every American newspaper that would print his name. Some historians argue this raid was never purely strategic, that for Arnold, burning the harbor of his own youth was as much about proving his new masters right as it was about denying privateers a port. Ledyard's insight was different, and it would cost him everything. He believed a fort, even a half-built one, existed to be held, not abandoned. When a British officer under a flag of truce demanded his surrender before a shot was fired, Ledyard refused. He would not be the man who gave up Groton without a fight. Word of the British landing had reached him only that morning, carried by alarm guns fired along the coast. There had been no time to drill his men, no time to properly distribute what little powder the fort held. He simply opened the gates to whoever showed up with a weapon and hoped it would be enough. That refusal sealed what came next. Arnold split his 800 men into two columns, landing on both banks of the Thames near noon. One column moved on lightly defended Fort Trumbull. On the New London side, it fell in minutes. The other, the larger of the two, turned toward Fort Griswold. On the Groton side, where Ledyard's garrison waited behind walls never designed to stop an army this size. From above, the fort looked almost like a star. 5 earthen points, a dry ditch, a line of palisade stakes jammed into the walls to slow any climb. Ledyard had roughly 160 men to cover a perimeter built for 400. Every gap in that wall was a decision. Cannon faced the river approach, where the British were expected to land in force. Muskets lined the weaker southern face, where they weren't. Palisade stakes, sharpened logs driven upright into the earth, ringed the outer wall to slow any man trying to climb. It would not be enough, but it would not be nothing either. From the British side, Lieutenant Colonel Edmund Eyre looked up at a fort he assumed would fold the moment his column arrived in force. His men had not eaten since before dawn. Many had marched under a punishing sun for hours to reach this hillside. To Eyre, Fort Griswold was a formality, a scattering of farmers behind a dirt wall, standing between his column and an easy victory. The night before, by several accounts, Ledyard had walked the fort's walls alone, counting powder horns by lantern light, aware that reinforcements were unlikely to arrive in time. He was wrong about very little that night, except how long his men would actually hold. Eyre was wrong within the first volley. If you found this story as maddening as I did, hit subscribe. Bastion history covers the battles that shaped the revolution and never made it into the textbooks. The attack began just after noon. Eyre's column advanced across open ground, in formation, expecting a token defense at best. Ledyard's gunners opened fire first. Grape shot tore into the front ranks. Eyre went down, badly wounded, and command shifted to Major Stephen Bromfield. The assault stalled at the ditch, then surged again, British soldiers throwing themselves against palisade stakes under musket fire from point-blank range. Pay attention to what happens on the southern wall. It decides everything that follows. Inside the fort, ammunition was already running short. Men were reloading with whatever powder they could scrape together, passing cartridges hand to hand along the firing line. Outside, wave after wave of British regulars pressed forward into a killing zone, barely wide enough to hold them. For nearly 40 minutes, the fort held. That is longer than almost anyone on either side expected. Then, on the weaker southern face, the wall Ledyard had never had enough men to properly cover, the line finally broke. British troops broke through a weak point on the southern face, pouring over and into the fort itself. What followed was hand-to-hand, bayonets, musket butts, knives, inside a space barely large enough to hold both sides at once. Ledyard saw what was coming. Surrounded, his men outnumbered 5 to 1 inside their own walls. He made the only choice left to him. He ordered the fort surrendered. According to multiple accounts from survivors, Ledyard stepped forward and offered his sword, hilt first, to the British officer in front of him. The formal, universal signal that resistance was over. What happened next is still debated by historians in its exact details, but not in its outcome. The officer took the sword, according to several surviving witnesses, and turned it back on Ledyard, killing him where he stood. And then, the killing did not stop. British soldiers, many of them enraged by their own losses at the wall, turned on a garrison that had already laid down its arms. Men who raised their hands were bayoneted where they stood. Wounded Americans lying on the ground were run through where they lay. By the time officers finally restored order, roughly 85 defenders were dead or dying, more men than had been lost storming the wall itself. That number is the kind historians double-check. A garrison of 160 had lost more than half its men after the fighting was already over. Across the river, Arnold watched New London burn. Warehouses, ships, and homes went up in flame through the afternoon, sending black smoke over a harbor he had once called home. He had won the raid. He had also, in a single afternoon, turned his own birth state into the place that would hate his name longest and loudest. Within days, word of what happened inside Fort Griswold's walls spread through Connecticut and beyond, not as a battle, but as an atrocity. Militia enlistments in the region spiked. Arnold's name, already poisoned for his betrayal at West Point a year earlier, became something closer to a curse. Strategically, the raid changed almost nothing. New London's privateers were already a dying threat by 1781, and the British High Command had little further use for the region. Some historians have called Fort Griswold the war's most pointless victory, a fort taken, a town burned, and a strategic gain that vanished within weeks. 6 weeks later, the war's true outcome would be decided 200 miles south at Yorktown. where Arnold's former commander, George Washington, would force Cornwallis to surrender an entire army. Fort Griswold changed no campaign, moved no army, altered no battle line, but it left something else behind. It became the final, ugly proof of who Benedict Arnold had chosen to become, a man who could stand on the soil of his own boyhood and order it burned, who could watch his own countrymen die after they had already given up their arms and call it a victory. For one afternoon in September, the fight for a half-built fort on a Connecticut hillside came down to 150 men who refused to run, and a wall that could not quite hold them safe.